On my birthday, my billionaire grandpa smiled and asked, "Is the apartment comfortable?" I shockingly replied, "What apartment?" My parents froze. He turned to them slowly and said, "Then where did the money go?" I never thought my 21st birthday would be the day my entire world would flip upside down, but here we are. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and this is the story of how I discovered my parents had been stealing from me for years, and how my grandfather made sure they paid for every single penny. Let me start from the beginning. My grandfather, Robert Mitchell, is what most people would call filthy rich. We're talking private jets, multiple mansions, and a business empire that spans 3 continents. He made his fortune in real estate development back in the 70s and never looked back. Despite his wealth, he's always been surprisingly down to earth with me, though I knew he had a complicated relationship with my parents, especially my father David, who is his son. Growing up, I lived a pretty normal middle-class life with my parents David and Linda Mitchell in suburban Chicago. Dad worked as a regional sales manager for a tech company, and Mom was a part-time accountant. We had a nice house, went on decent vacations, and I never wanted for much. But I always wondered why we weren't living it up more, considering Grandpa's wealth. Whenever I asked, Dad would get this tight expression and mumble something about earning our own way and not depending on handouts. The thing is, I rarely saw Grandpa Robert growing up. He lived in New York, and we maybe visited him twice a year, always brief, somewhat tense affairs. Mom and Dad would be on edge the entire time, and conversations felt forced and uncomfortable. I chalked it up to typical family dynamics, maybe some old grudges or personality clashes. What I didn't know was that Grandpa had been sending money for me all along. The revelation started about a month before my birthday. I was finishing up my junior year at Northwestern University, majoring in business administration, when I got an unexpected call from a law office in New York. The secretary explained that Mr. Robert Mitchell's attorney wanted to schedule a call with me regarding financial arrangements. I was confused but curious. When I spoke with the lawyer, James Harrison, he asked me some strange questions. "How are you finding your living arrangements, Miss Mitchell? Is the apartment in Lincoln Park working out well for you?" I was baffled because I was living in a tiny dorm room that I shared with my roommate Jessica. When I explained this, there was a long pause on the other end. "Miss Mitchell, I think we need to have a conversation. Are you available to come to New York this weekend? Your grandfather would like to see you." Something in his tone made my stomach drop, but I agreed. I told my parents I was going to visit Grandpa for the weekend, which made them both visibly uncomfortable, but they didn't try to stop me. That Saturday, I found myself in the most intimidating law office I'd ever seen, sitting across from my grandfather and his attorney. Grandpa looked older than I remembered, his silver hair perfectly styled, wearing an expensive navy suit. His pale blue eyes were sharp and calculating, and for the first time, I could see the businessman who had built an empire. "Sarah," he began, his voice warm but serious, "I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to be completely honest with me." James Harrison slid a folder across the mahogany table. "Miss Mitchell, for the past 5 years, your grandfather has been sending monthly payments of $5,000 to your parents, specifically designated for your housing, education expenses, and general welfare while you're in college." My mouth fell open. $5,000 a month for 5 years. That was $300,000. "The payments," Harrison continued, "were specifically earmarked for securing you a nice apartment near campus, covering your tuition beyond what scholarships provided, ensuring you had a car, and giving you a comfortable living allowance. Your grandfather wanted to make sure you could focus on your studies without financial stress." I stared at the documents he showed me. Bank transfers, all made out to my father, David Mitchell, with detailed memos about their intended purpose. My mind was reeling. "Grandpa," I whispered, "I didn't know about any of this. I'm living in a dorm room that costs $800 a month, I'm working 2 part-time jobs to pay for food and books, and I take the bus everywhere because I can't afford a car." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. My grandfather's expression hardened, and I saw a flash of something dangerous in his eyes. "Sarah, where do you think that money went?" I couldn't answer because I was starting to realize the horrible truth. My parents had been pocketing the money meant for me. All of it? The meeting lasted 2 more hours. Grandpa and his lawyer showed me bank records, email communications, and documented agreements. Everything was meticulously organized, as I would expect from a man of his success. The arrangement had been simple. Grandpa would provide for my college years so I could graduate debt-free and have a good start in life, but he wanted it to go through my parents because he believed in maintaining family structure. "I thought it was important for your parents to be involved in your care," he explained, his voice heavy with disappointment. "I wanted them to have the dignity of being providers. I never imagined they would steal from their own daughter." As I sat there processing this betrayal, Grandpa made me an offer that would change everything. "Sarah, I want you to come work for me this summer as an intern at Mitchell Development. Learn the business. But more importantly, I want to give you the opportunity to handle this situation with your parents however you see fit. You can confront them, you can let it slide, or... He paused, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. You can let me handle it my way. I was angry. Angrier than I'd ever been in my life. All those nights I'd worked late shifts at the campus coffee shop while struggling to keep up with my coursework. All the times I'd eaten ramen for dinner because I couldn't afford groceries. All the stress about how I was going to pay back my student loans. And my parents had been sitting on $300,000 that was meant for me. What did you have in mind, Grandpa? His smile grew wider, and for a moment, I could see where he'd gotten his reputation as a ruthless businessman. Well, your birthday is coming up in 3 weeks. I think it's time I visited Chicago for a family celebration. The next few weeks were surreal. I went back to school and continued my normal routine, but everything felt different. I looked at my cramped dorm room, my second-hand textbooks, my work schedule at the coffee shop, and felt this burning rage building inside me. The hardest part was talking to my parents on the phone and pretending everything was normal. How was your visit with Grandpa? Mom had asked when I got back. It was nice, I'd replied, fighting to keep my voice steady. We just caught up. Meanwhile, Grandpa was putting his plan into motion. He called my parents directly, something he rarely did, and announced that he wanted to celebrate my 21st birthday in Chicago. He would fly in and take us all to dinner at one of the city's most expensive restaurants. My parents couldn't refuse without seeming ungracious, though I could tell from Dad's voice when he called me that he was nervous about it. Your grandfather wants to have dinner at Alinea for your birthday, Dad said, naming a restaurant where a meal cost more than I made in a month at my coffee job. It's generous of him. That sounds amazing, Dad, I replied, putting on my best excited voice. I can't wait. The night before my birthday dinner, I could barely sleep. Grandpa had flown in that afternoon and was staying at the Four Seasons. We texted briefly, and his message was simple: tomorrow, you'll have all the answers you need. Are you ready? I was ready. The dinner was set for 7 p.m. on Saturday, my actual birthday. I met my parents at home first, and I could see they were both nervous. Mom had bought a new dress for the occasion, and Dad was wearing his best suit, the one he usually reserved for major business presentations. They kept asking me if I knew what Grandpa wanted to talk about, if he'd mentioned anything during my visit to New York. He seemed happy to see me, I said truthfully. I think he just wants to celebrate. When we arrived at Alinea, Grandpa was already waiting at a prime table. He stood to greet us, impeccably dressed as always, and hugged me warmly. Happy birthday, sweetheart, he said, loud enough for my parents to hear. 21 years old. You're a young woman now. The first part of dinner was surprisingly pleasant. Grandpa ordered an expensive bottle of wine and regaled us with stories about his recent business trips to Dubai and Singapore. He asked me about school, my classes, my plans for the future. My parents gradually relaxed, probably thinking this was just going to be a normal family dinner. But I could see something calculating in Grandpa's eyes, the way he would pause slightly before responding to my parents' comments, the way he seemed to be studying them. He was playing a game, and they had no idea. As we were finishing the main course, Grandpa suddenly turned his full attention to me. Sarah, I've been thinking about your living situation at school, he said, his voice casual but clear. Is the apartment comfortable? I know Lincoln Park can be expensive, but I wanted to make sure you had a nice place to stay during your college years. The question hit the table like a bomb. My parents went very still, and I could see the color draining from Dad's face. This was the moment we'd all been building toward. I looked directly at my grandfather, keeping my voice steady and innocent. What apartment, Grandpa? I live in a dorm room at school. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the soft conversations from other tables, the gentle clink of silverware, but at our table, nobody breathed. My parents were frozen, Mom's wine glass halfway to her lips, Dad's hand gripping his napkin so tightly his knuckles were white. They looked like deer caught in headlights. Grandpa turned slowly to face my father, and his expression transformed completely. Gone was the pleasant, grandfatherly demeanor. This was the face of a man who had built a billion-dollar empire, who had crushed competitors and made impossible deals. This was Robert Mitchell the businessman, and he was terrifying. Then where, he said, each word deliberate and cold, did the money go? Dad's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. Mom set down her wine glass with a shaking hand. Dad, I can explain, my father finally managed. Can you? Grandpa's voice was deadly quiet. Can you explain where $300,000 went? Money that was specifically designated for my granddaughter's welfare? Money that was sent with explicit instructions and detailed accounting requirements that you completely ignored? I watched my parents' faces as the full scope of their situation became clear. They hadn't just stolen money, they'd been caught by someone with the resources to destroy them completely. Sarah doesn't know, does she? Grandpa continued, though of course he knew she didn't, since we planned this whole thing. She doesn't know that while she's been working 2 jobs and eating ramen noodles, you've been using her money to finance your lifestyle. Dad found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. We used it for household expenses. Sarah lives at home during breaks, so we thought. You thought wrong. Grandpa's voice cut through Dad's excuse like a knife. The money was not for household expenses. It was not for your mortgage, your car payments, or your vacation to Hawaii last spring. It was for Sarah's apartment, her education costs, her car, and her living expenses. Every penny was accounted for in our agreement. Mom finally spoke up, her voice trembling. Robert, we can pay it back. We just need some time too. Time? Grandpa laughed, but there was no humor in it. You've had 5 years to do the right thing. 5 years while my granddaughter struggled unnecessarily because you decided to steal from her. I was watching this all unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and genuine shock. I had known my parents had taken the money, but seeing them confronted with it so directly, seeing them squirm and make excuses, was both vindicating and heartbreaking. Here's what's going to happen, Grandpa continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone dictating terms to a defeated opponent. First, you're going to provide me with a complete accounting of where every dollar went. I want receipts, bank statements, everything. Second, you're going to pay back every penny, with interest. Third, Sarah is going to come work for me this summer and every summer until she graduates, and she'll be compensated appropriately for her time. Dad was sweating now, despite the air conditioning in the restaurant. Dad, we don't have that kind of money liquid. Our savings, the house. Then you'll figure it out, Grandpa said flatly. Sell the house, liquidate your retirement accounts, take out loans. I don't care how you do it, but you will pay back what you stole from your daughter. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of tense conversation and stilted attempts at normalcy. My parents barely touched their food, while Grandpa calmly enjoyed his meal and continued to make pleasant conversation with me about my future plans. It was like watching someone conduct a symphony of psychological warfare. As we were leaving the restaurant, Grandpa pulled me aside while my parents waited by the valet station. Sarah, I want you to know that this gives me no pleasure, he said quietly. They're still my son and daughter-in-law, and they're your parents. But what they did was unforgivable, and there have to be consequences. I hugged him tightly. Thank you, Grandpa. For everything. You don't need to thank me, sweetheart. This money was always meant for you. I'm just sorry it took so long to discover what they'd done. The drive home with my parents was the most uncomfortable 20 minutes of my life. Nobody spoke until we pulled into our driveway. Sarah, Dad began, turning to face me from the driver's seat. I know how this looks, but you have to understand. Understand what, Dad? I asked, and I couldn't keep the anger out of my voice anymore. Understand that while I was working 30 hours a week on top of a full course load, you were spending money that was meant for me? Understand that I've been stressing about student loans and living expenses while you had $300,000 that belonged to me? Mom started crying then, soft, quiet sobs that might have made me feel guilty if I hadn't been so furious. We never meant for it to go this far, she whispered. At first, we just borrowed a little bit to help with some unexpected expenses. We were going to pay it back before you ever knew. But then one thing led to another, and we kept telling ourselves we'd make it right, but you didn't, I finished. You just kept taking it, month after month, year after year. Do you have any idea what these past few years have been like for me? The stress, the exhaustion, the constant worry about money? Dad was looking down at his hands, unable to meet my eyes. We'll make it right, Sarah. We'll pay back every penny. You're damn right you will, I said, and I saw them both flinch at the harshness in my voice. Because if you don't, Grandpa will make sure everyone knows what you did. Your colleagues, your friends, your clients. He has the resources to ruin you completely, and after what you've done, I'm not sure I'd try to stop him. That summer, I moved to New York and started working for Mitchell Development. Grandpa set me up in a beautiful one-bedroom apartment in Manhattan, got me a reliable car, and paid me more for my internship than I'd made in an entire year at my campus jobs. For the first time in years, I could focus on learning and growing without constantly worrying about money. The work was fascinating. I got to see how Grandpa's empire operated from the inside, sitting in on high-level meetings, learning about property development, financing, and deal negotiation. But more than that, I got to know my grandfather as a person, not just as the distant family patriarch. My first week at Mitchell Development was overwhelming in the best possible way. The headquarters occupied 3 floors of a gleaming Manhattan skyscraper, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering stunning views of Central Park. My desk was in a corner office that was bigger than my old dorm room, and I had access to resources I'd never dreamed of. Grandpa introduced me to the senior staff as his granddaughter, but made it clear that I was there to learn and contribute, not just observe. Sarah will be working directly with our development teams this summer, he announced during the Monday morning staff meeting. She's here on merit, not nepotism, so I expect you to challenge her and teach her everything you can. The first project I was assigned to involved a mixed-use development in Brooklyn. The lead architect, Maria Santos, was a brilliant woman in her 40s who had worked with Grandpa for over a decade. She took me under her wing and showed me how to read construction blueprints, understand zoning regulations, and analyze market feasibility studies. Your grandfather is one of the most demanding bosses I've ever had, Maria told me during lunch one day, but he's also the most fair. He judges people based on their work, their integrity, and their ability to solve problems. If you can prove yourself here, you'll be ready for anything. The learning curve was steep, but I threw myself into it completely. For the first time in years, I wasn't worried about how I was going to pay for groceries or whether I could afford new textbooks. Instead, I could focus entirely on absorbing everything I could about the business world. One evening, about 3 weeks into my internship, Grandpa invited me to join him for a client dinner. The client was a major hotel chain looking to develop properties in 3 different cities, and the deal was worth over $200 million. I want you to observe everything, Grandpa told me as we rode to the restaurant in his car. Watch how they negotiate, what questions they ask, how they respond to different proposals. This is where you'll learn more in 2 hours than you could from a semester of business school. The dinner was a masterclass in high-stakes negotiation. Grandpa was charming and personable, but I could see the calculating businessman underneath every smile and casual comment. He had clearly done extensive research on the hotel executives, knowing their backgrounds, their company's recent performance, and their personal interests. By the end of the evening, he had secured preliminary agreements for 2 of the 3 developments, with a 3rd meeting scheduled for the following week. How did you know that Mr. Peterson's daughter was studying architecture at Yale? I asked as we left the restaurant. Grandpa smiled. Information is power, Sarah. The more you know about the people you're dealing with, the better you can serve their needs and protect your own interests. Peterson's been worried about his daughter's career prospects, so when I mentioned our internship program for promising architecture students, I wasn't just making small talk. I was showing him that we care about the same things he cares about. This was a side of business I'd never considered before. It wasn't just about numbers and contracts, it was about understanding people, building relationships, and finding ways to create value for everyone involved. As the weeks passed, I found myself staying later at the office, not because I had to, but because I was genuinely fascinated by the work. I started contributing ideas during project meetings, suggesting market research approaches and identifying potential challenges in development timelines. To my surprise, the senior staff began taking my suggestions seriously. You have good instincts, James Morrison, the head of acquisitions, told me after I'd identified a potential zoning issue that could have delayed a project by 6 months. Most people your age would have focused on the glamorous aspects of development, but you're looking at the practical problems that can make or break a deal. But the work also gave me a new perspective on what my parents had done. Every day, I was surrounded by people making decisions involving millions of dollars, handling enormous responsibilities with integrity and professionalism. The contrast with my parents' behavior was stark and painful. One afternoon, I was reviewing financial projections for a residential development when it hit me that the amount my parents had stolen could have funded the entire marketing budget for the project. $300,000 wasn't just money they'd taken from me, it was money that could have changed my entire trajectory in life. I found myself getting angry all over again, not just at the theft itself, but at the casual way they dismissed its impact. They'd acted like it was no big deal, like I should be grateful they'd even provided me with basic necessities. But seeing how business really worked, understanding the value of financial resources and opportunities, made their betrayal feel even worse. That evening, I called my parents for our weekly check-in. They'd been calling religiously since the dinner confrontation, trying to maintain some semblance of a normal relationship while dealing with the financial consequences of their actions. How's the internship going, sweetheart? Mom asked, her voice carefully cheerful. It's amazing, Mom. I'm learning so much about business development and project management. Grandpa's been incredibly generous with his time and knowledge. There was a pause on the other end. That's wonderful, Sarah. We're so proud of you. Are you? I asked, unable to keep the itch out of my voice. Because I've been thinking about something. Do you have any idea what $300,000 could have done for my future? Not just paying for an apartment or a car, but real opportunities. Investment accounts, business connections, startup capital for my own projects someday. You didn't just steal my college fund. You stole years of potential growth and opportunity. Dad got on the phone then. Sarah, we know we made a terrible mistake. We're working as hard as we can to make it right. I know you are, I said, and I meant it. But I need you to understand that this isn't just about paying back money. It's about trust, about family, about the person I thought you were versus who you actually turned out to be. The conversation ended awkwardly, as most of our calls did those days, but I could tell they were starting to grasp the full scope of what they'd done. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the life I could have had, the stress I wouldn't have endured, the opportunities I might have pursued if I'd had the financial freedom they'd stolen from me. The next day, Grandpa asked me to join him for lunch, just the two of us. We went to a quiet restaurant near the office, and I could tell he had something important to discuss. "How are you handling all of this, Sarah?" he asked once we'd ordered. "The work is demanding, but I'm more concerned about the emotional side of what you've been dealing with." I'd been wondering when this conversation would come up. Some days are harder than others, I admit it. I love the work, and I'm grateful for all the opportunities you've given me. But I'm still processing what Mom and Dad did, and some days I'm angrier than others. Grandpa nodded thoughtfully. Anger can be a powerful motivator, but it can also be destructive if you let it consume you. I've seen too many people in business make terrible decisions because they couldn't move past their anger at someone who had wronged them. Are you saying I should just forgive them and move on? Not at all. What they did was inexcusable, and there should be consequences. But I want you to make sure you're building something positive from this experience, not just tearing something down. He was right, and I knew it. The internship wasn't just about learning business skills, it was about figuring out who I wanted to become and what kind of life I wanted to build. I couldn't let my parents' betrayal define me forever. You know, Sarah, he continued, I've been thinking about why your father made the choices he did. I think part of it was pride. He's always resented my success, always felt like he had to prove he could make it on his own. When the money started coming in, he probably told himself he deserved it, that he was finally getting his fair share of the family wealth. That doesn't excuse what he did. No, it doesn't. But understanding someone's motivations can help you figure out how to prevent similar problems in the future. In business, you'll encounter people who make bad decisions for all kinds of reasons. The key is learning to protect yourself while still giving people the chance to do better. This conversation stayed with me for weeks. I started to see my parents' situation not just as a personal betrayal, but as a case study in how good people can make terrible decisions when they let pride and financial pressure cloud their judgment. You know, Sarah, he told me one evening as we were reviewing plans for a new development in Miami, I always hoped you'd want to be part of the business someday. You have the intelligence and the instincts for it. But I wanted it to be your choice, not something forced on you by circumstances. Meanwhile, my parents were struggling to meet Grandpa's repayment demands. They'd put the house on the market, liquidated Dad's 401k, and taken out a substantial loan. It was painful to watch, but I reminded myself that they'd brought this on themselves. The house sale was particularly difficult for our family. It was the home I'd grown up in, where I'd had birthday parties and Christmas mornings, where I'd studied for my SATs and gotten ready for prom. Mom called me the day they got the offer, crying as she told me about packing up 20 years of memories into boxes. I know we have no right to feel sorry for ourselves, she said through her tears, but it's hard, Sarah. This house was supposed to be our legacy, something we could leave to you someday. I felt a complicated mix of emotions hearing her pain. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay. But another part of me was still too angry to offer that kind of support. You made your choices, Mom, I said, trying to keep my voice gentle but firm. The house was never going to be my legacy anyway if you'd spent my inheritance before I ever saw it. The conversation ended with both of us in tears, but I knew it was important for her to understand the full scope of what they'd lost. It wasn't just money, it was the future they'd planned, the security they'd built, the stability they'd provided for our family. Dad was handling the practical aspects of their financial restructuring, and I could see the stress wearing on him every time we spoke. He'd always been a proud man, someone who prided himself on being a good provider for his family. Having to sell everything and start over in his 50s was devastating to his sense of identity. I keep thinking about all the ways I could have handled this differently, he told me during one of our phone calls. If I'd just been honest with your grandfather from the beginning, if I'd asked for help instead of taking what wasn't mine, if I'd prioritized your needs over my pride. These conversations were emotionally exhausting, but they were also necessary. For the first time in years, my parents and I were having real, honest discussions about money, family, and responsibility. It wasn't comfortable, but it was authentic in a way our relationship had never been before. During one of my weekend visits back to Chicago, I saw their new apartment for the first time. It was a stark contrast to the house I'd grown up in, a small two-bedroom unit in a modest complex across town. The furniture was mostly secondhand, and they'd had to get rid of most of their possessions to make the move. But there was something different about the way my parents carried themselves in that space. They seemed more honest, more grounded, less concerned with keeping up appearances. Mom was cooking dinner when I arrived, and instead of the elaborate meals she used to prepare when we had company, she made a simple pasta dish with vegetables from a local farmer's market. We're learning to live differently, she explained as we sat down to eat. We're discovering that we don't need as much as we thought we did to be happy. Dad nodded, looking around their small dining area. In some ways, this is the most honest our family has been in years. We're not pretending to be wealthier than we are, we're not hiding financial stress from each other, and we're not making decisions based on what other people might think. I had to admit that there was something refreshing about their new approach to life. The constant undercurrent of financial anxiety that had always been present in our household was gone, replaced by a different kind of stress, but also by a new kind of clarity about what really mattered. That evening, as I was getting ready to drive back to my apartment, Dad pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Sarah, I want you to know that your mother and I have been talking to a counselor," he said. "Not couples therapy, but someone who specializes in financial behavior and family dynamics. We're trying to understand how we got to this point, how we let ourselves rationalize taking money that belonged to you." I was surprised by this revelation. My parents had always been skeptical of therapy, viewing it as something for people who couldn't handle their problems on their own. "What have you learned?" I asked. Dad was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with how to articulate his thoughts. "I think I spent so many years feeling inadequate compared to your grandfather that I convinced myself I deserved compensation for that feeling. When the money started coming in, it felt like validation, like finally getting recognition for all the years I'd felt overlooked and undervalued. But you knew it wasn't meant for you?" I did know that, and that's the part I'm having the hardest time understanding about myself. The counselor says it's common for people to create elaborate justifications for behavior they know is wrong, especially when they're dealing with long-standing feelings of resentment or inadequacy. This conversation gave me a new perspective on my father's actions. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it helped me understand the emotional complexity behind his decisions. He wasn't just a greedy person who had stolen from his daughter, he was someone who had made terrible choices while struggling with his own feelings of failure and resentment. The house sold quickly, for about $50,000 more than they owed on the mortgage. They found a small apartment across town and started a long process of rebuilding their financial lives. Dad had to take on freelance consulting work in addition to his regular job, and Mom picked up extra accounting clients. They were working harder than they had in years, and I could see the stress wearing on them. But slowly, something started to change in our family dynamic. With the truth finally out in the open, we could have honest conversations for the first time in years. My parents stopped making excuses and started taking real responsibility for what they'd done. "I don't expect you to forgive us anytime soon," Mom said during one of our phone calls. "What we did was inexcusable. We stole from you, our own daughter, and we let you struggle when we could have prevented it. But I want you to know that we're going to make this right, no matter how long it takes." Dad was more direct when I saw him in person. "I failed you, Sarah. As a father, as a man, as a human being. I let greed and poor financial decisions turn me into someone I don't recognize. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making up for it." By the end of that summer, my parents had managed to pay back about $60,000 of what they owed. It wasn't nearly enough, but it was a start, and I could see they were genuinely committed to the process. When I went back to school for my senior year, everything was different. Grandpa had arranged for me to have a beautiful apartment near campus, complete with a study space and a full kitchen. I had a reliable car and enough money to focus entirely on my studies and internship applications. For the first time in my college career, I felt like I could breathe. But the most significant change was in my relationship with my family. The lies and secrets that had poisoned our interactions for years were finally gone. My parents and I started having real conversations about money, responsibility, and what it meant to be family. It wasn't easy, and there were plenty of difficult moments, but it was honest in a way it had never been before. The full repayment took almost 3 years. My parents paid back the principal plus the interest that Grandpa had calculated, coming to a total of about $360,000. They lost their house, depleted their retirement savings, and had to fundamentally change their lifestyle, but they did it. During my senior year, Grandpa offered me a full-time position at Mitchell Development after graduation. The salary was generous, the work was challenging, and the opportunity to learn from one of the most successful real estate developers in the country was invaluable. "But," he said during our conversation about my future, "I want you to take the job because you want it, not because you feel obligated. You don't owe me anything, Sarah. The money I sent for your education was never a loan or an investment in your future labor. It was a gift from a grandfather to his granddaughter, nothing more. I took the job because I genuinely loved the work and wanted to learn from him." Over the next few years, I worked my way up through the company, learning every aspect of the business. Grandpa was a demanding but fair mentor, and I discovered that I had a real aptitude for development and deal-making. 5 years after that confrontation at Alinea, my parents had fully repaid their debt and slowly begun to rebuild their lives. Dad had parlayed his consulting work into a small but successful business, and Mom had built up a steady client base for her accounting services. They were living modestly but honestly, and our relationship, while forever changed, had grown stronger in some ways. The most surprising development was the gradual reconciliation between my father and grandfather. It took years of consistent effort on Dad's part, but eventually, Grandpa began to respect the way his son had handled the consequences of his actions. He made a terrible mistake, Grandpa told me one day, but he owned up to it and did the work to make it right. That counts for something. Last year, I was promoted to Vice President of Development at Mitchell Development, making me the youngest person ever to hold that position in the company. At the celebration dinner, both of my parents were there, proud and supportive despite everything we'd been through. As I looked around the table at Grandpa, who was beaming with pride, and at my parents, who had worked so hard to earn back their dignity and our trust, I realized that the confrontation at my 21st birthday dinner had been the best gift anyone could have given me. Not because it exposed the truth about the stolen money, though that was important, but because it forced all of us to confront who we really were and who we wanted to be. The money was never really the point. The point was honesty, accountability, and what it means to be a family. My parents had betrayed their trust in the worst possible way, but they'd also worked harder than I ever imagined possible to earn it back. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying someone who's wronged you. Sometimes it's giving them the chance to become the person they should have been all along and watching them rise to meet that challenge. Looking back now, I can see that my 21st birthday was the day I really became an adult, not just in legal terms, but in understanding what it means to take responsibility for your actions and demand the same from the people you love. And every time I drive past Alinea, I smile and remember the night my grandfather asked a simple question that changed all of our lives: then where did the money go?